Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum and welcome to this session on controlling procurements. Procurements management is a subject which PM Box 6 deals very differently from the rest of the knowledge areas, and this will become soon apparent. I'll start by first looking at what procurement documents are. PM Box 6 introduced categorization of project documents, and one of the categories was, or rather is procurement documents. Procurement documents comprise a plethora of documents like the tendering documents or the bidding documents, request for information, request for proposal, request for quotation, etc., procurement statement of work. Then the contracts or agreements along with their terms and conditions, records of payments, quality aspects in the form of audits and inspections, and all the operating and technical manuals and drawings which are part of the contract. So all this documentation forms part of the procurement documents. I will now allude to a major change which PM Box 6 made in the context of procurement management. Before PM Box 6, procurement knowledge area had 4 processes: plan procurement management, conduct procurements, control procurements, and close procurements. The activities to be performed by the closed procurements are indicated in these 2 boxes, the red being the operational level activities, and the black ones, the administrative activities. However, PM Box 6 eliminated closed procurements process and transferred the operational activities to the control procurements process. And it transferred the administrative activities, which are in black, to the close project process. Let's have a closer look at these 3 processes. Here they are. The plan procurement management process primarily deals with preparing for tendering or preparing for contracting. And in this respect, the major portion of this process deals with preparing the tendering documents. And of course, once the bids start coming in, they have to be evaluated. And therefore, creating or establishing a criteria on the basis of which the bids would be evaluated. Hence, the 2 key outputs of this process are the bidding documents and the source selection criteria, the criteria on the basis of which the bids would be evaluated. Coming to the executing process, the conduct procurements. Contrary to its name, it's in fact not conduct procurements because not a single screw is procured in this process. It is in fact conducting tendering leading to a contract, or let's say conduct contracting process. And if the name is changed to conduct contracting, it will be better understood. And as can be seen, its key output is agreements or the contract, and nothing happens in this process after the agreement has been signed. So no procurement actually takes place in conduct procurement. Coming to control procurements, it is not just control procurements, but it is also conduct procurements. So the scope of this process is now quite large. It involves both the monitoring and control aspects as well as the executing aspects. And this division will become now very clear as we look at a procurement management step by step. Here are the activities which are performed in the planning process of planned procurement management. And as you can see, it is basically preparing towards creating the procurement documents and then determining the source selection criteria. So all this work which is done over here is towards creating these two outputs. Once this has been done, then obviously the process of tendering starts with finding the sellers, potential sellers from the pre-qualified list or through advertisements. And then all this process is carried out, eventually culminating in the signing of the contract. And as you can see, after signing of the contract or the agreement, nothing else happens in this particular phase. But then comes controlling procurement. And as you can see, everything and anything to do with executing the procurements is done in this process. And we are going to have a detailed look at all these points in a minute. And then finally is the closing procurement. And as I said earlier, this process has now been closed in PMBOK 6. It doesn't exist anymore, but its operational activities, which are indicated in the red, have been transferred to the controlling procurement process, and the black activities, which are the administrative activities, have been transferred to the closed project. So let's now look at the process of controlling procurement. This is a process. Now, this is verbatim from PMBOK 6. I haven't added anything from my own side. So according to PMBOK 6, controlling procurements is a process of managing procurement relationships. I'll talk about this more when I talk about relationships between the seller and the buyer, and also when I talk about interfaces between multiple sellers. Then it talks of monitoring contract performance. However, when this point is seen in conjunction with this point, it says ensures that both the sellers and the buyers' performances meets procurement requirements according to the terms of the agreement. So if the two are read together, obviously this is not just monitoring. Its context is much more than monitoring. It is both monitoring and controlling contract performance. Then the process of controlling procurement deals with changes and changes to the contract. Contract can be changed at any time during any phase with the consent of all the parties involved. So it deals with changes through the formal change control procedure. And then controlling procurements is performed throughout the project as needed. Now let's look at some of the activities which are performed in control procurements, and I will be spending better part of this session on discussing these points one by one. The first aspect is managing relationships between the buyer and the seller, ensuring that both parties perform in accordance with the contract. Obviously, if a contract or a procurement contract is to succeed, then both parties to the contract must implement the contract in letter and spirit. If one or both parties default, it spells doom for the project and the contract. Therefore, it is very important that both parties perform in accordance with the contract, and control procurement aims at ensuring that that happens. Then is the aspect of reviewing invoices and claims. This is particularly important for cost reimbursable contracts, where in fact every claim or every invoice is subject to an audit. a thorough scrutiny of the invoice takes place to make sure that it has been put up correctly along with all the supporting documents. Managing changes to the contract, as I said earlier, a contract can be changed anytime with the consent of the signing parties, but the changes must go through the formal change control procedures through the change control board. Controlling communication with the seller, it is important that only the points of contacts of both the buyer and the seller only communicate and no one else. Because if everyone starts communicating from both sides, then there are chances of miscommunication, misinterpretation, and all there's a risk of falling into a legal default by either party. Therefore, it is very important that whosoever are mentioned at points of contacts in the contract communicate and no one else. Also, all communication must be documented. Even if it is a WhatsApp image or a message, it should be documented. It should be transferred to an email. It should be uploaded as an email. And then that email, a printout of that email should be taken and documented as part of the project or procurement communication between the buyer and the seller. The point being that let there be no misunderstanding, let there be no miscommunication leading to subsequent issues and disputes. Interpreting the contract correctly, and that's where a little legal help would be welcome. It is very important that both parties understand all the terms and conditions of the contract. That is why after a seller has been selected, a lot of time is spent on negotiations. And those negotiations are not on the cost. That has been settled through the bidding process. These negotiations are on the terms and conditions of the contract. And because so much time is spent on this, it is understood that both the buyer and the seller understand the meaning of each and every term, condition, and word used in the contract. And then the implications of any actions which is over and above the contract should be clearly understood. For example, if the buyer stops the payment of the seller against or which is not covered in the contract or in the payment schedule, then he stands to face a legal implication, and therefore it is going to be a likely cause of a dispute. So it is very important that both the buyer and the seller understand and interpret the contract clearly and correctly. And both parties should have legal help so that they don't make such a mistake of misinterpreting or violating any term or condition of the contract. The next 2 points deal with reports. The first report is from the seller. In every the procurement contract, the seller makes a report, a regular report on the status of contract and procurements to the buyer. In this report, the seller reports what was required to be done by a particular time and how much of that has been done. And then what is the status of the deliverables? Or have they just been delivered, or they have been also installed and commissioned? So he gives a complete report on his performance, that is the performance of his deliverables and the status of his deliverables. And he usually takes advantage of this report to attach his invoices, which he requests to be cleared because he has fulfilled the particular clauses of the contract. Once the buyer has received that report, then he generates a report of his own, but not to the seller, but to his own management. He would make this report to either the program manager or to the head of the PMO or to the CEO. And in this report, taking into cognizance the report of the seller, he is going to report to his management as to where the project is in terms of its deliverables, in terms of its time, in terms of its cost. And if everything is going according to the contract, according to the plan, then he would suggest to the management to approve payment to the contract in accordance with the payment to the contractor in accordance with the contract. So these two reports are always very significant in a good procurement project or in a procurement contract. Next point is about holding procurement review meetings. These are very similar to project review meetings, and therefore their agenda and their terms of reference and the rules of business are more or less the same. Then is monitoring the triple constraints, the basic constraints of cost, schedule, and scope. I would go a step forward and say it's just not monitoring, but also controlling the cost, schedule, and scope aspects of the procurement. The cost, monitoring and controlling the cost becomes very important in the context of cost reimbursable contracts, because the payments to the seller have to be made based on what costs have been incurred, and then a profit to the seller is to be given on the basis of a percentage of the basic project or the contract cost. So it is very important that these costs are monitored and controlled, because they will then eventually project into the future to give us what the project is going to cost or what the particular items are eventually going to cost towards the project. Monitoring and controlling schedule is important from the point of view of liquidated damages. Should the seller default on the schedule baseline, he is liable to pay to the buyer what are known as liquidated damages, which are usually a percentage of time, and therefore it is very important to monitor and control schedule. And then extremely important is monitoring and controlling scope, because scope is the basis of the validate scope process, based on which the buyer would accept the deliverable from the seller if it fulfills all the technical parameters and all during tests and trials which are carried out by the buyer's quality control team. So that is the importance of monitoring and controlling the three basic constraints. Then is the aspect of controlling quality. During the procurement process, a number of audits and inspections will be performed, audits of the procurement process itself, the inspection of the working of the seller, the deliverables, etc., and their results form the basis of quality reports, and hence a very important aspect of quality control that is performed in controlling procurements. Monitoring and controlling procurement risks. Now, first of all, let me draw your attention to the use of this word controlling. This word has been used in Rita's the latest edition, Rita 9, on page 544. And if you recall our discussion in the class, PM Box 6 had expressly stated that risks cannot be controlled. But here we are, Rita's book, which is supposed to be an amplification of PMBOK, clearly states that risks can indeed be controlled. Anyway, risks, as we know, are a cradle to grave process. They start even before the project is born and they continue until the project is closed. And since procurement is also part of the project, therefore, new risks keep coming up. They need to be identified, analyzed, provided with contingencies, contingency reserves, and allocated or assigned with a plan or a strategy to deal with those risks. Then managing interfaces between all sellers. And I would like to dwell a little on this particular aspect. Why should there be multiple sellers on a project or in a procurement? This is primarily for the buyer to mitigate the risk that our seller could go out of business. It also prevents the buyer from putting all the eggs in one basket, and therefore, usually multiple sellers are selected for a procurement process. And just to give you an example, that this Kashmir highway, which is only a small length of highway, was divided into 3 packages, and it was allocated to 3 different contractors. The idea being the same, having multiple sellers. Here I'm using the word seller in the broader context of the contractor. So a procurement can have multiple sellers primarily to mitigate risk. And when it says here interfaces between all the sellers, these interfaces could be in the context of multiple sellers when there is a requirement or when there is a bulk requirement for project materials. Like on a construction project, there is a bulk requirement for aggregate or steel or cement or timber and other material. And the second context is where the materials are not required in bulk, but the items are huge and they are supplied by different vendors. In either case, the interfaces could be time interfaces, these could be supply chain interfaces between the sellers, must be very carefully managed, monitored, and controlled. Take, for instance, the bulk materials. It should be ensured that the supply line for these bulk materials does not dry up, because if it dries up, it is going to affect the pace of the project and it is likely to get delayed. That said, there shouldn't be a glut of this bulk material at the project site. In that case, the project will run into a problem of storage of these items. And if these are these can't be sensitive items, which in fact is my next point, talking about non-bulk items supplied by different suppliers. Here, the project or procurement manager is to act like a conductor of an orchestra. He cues one set of musicians or one set of instruments, stops them, and then he cues the other ones. He has to perform the same task, or he is to give cue for a certain seller to provide the material and a certain seller to hold the material. Let me give you another simple example. Let's say a project involves installation of a lift. Now, that lift should not arrive at the project site until it is ready to be installed. If the lift chute is not ready or the building itself is not ready, there's no point in bringing the lift to the project site, or else it would lapse its warranty sitting in the crate. So this is what is essentially meant by managing interfaces between all sellers. Let me make one more point in the context of bulk materials. If in the context of non-bulk materials, the project manager or the procurement manager is to act like a conductor of an orchestra, giving cues, which is managing the interfaces, giving cues to different orchestra players, musicians on different instruments. Likewise, in bulk materials, the project or procurement manager is to act like a control rod in a nuclear reactor. Just as a control rod in a nuclear reactor controls the nuclear reaction, likewise, he is to control the arrival of bulk materials at the project site. He shouldn't let the supply line dry up, and he shouldn't create a glut of bulk material at the project site. So this is essentially what is meant by managing interfaces between all sellers. Handling and resolving claims and disputes. We are going to discuss this when we discuss tools and techniques. We'll leave it for the time being. Then, accepting the deliverables if they have been validated in the validate scope process by our own control quality. If the seller has delivered the deliverables and our quality control team, having taken the deliverables through the thorough testing and inspections, has cleared the deliverables, we must accept the deliverable. There is no point in dragging our feet on the acceptance. Good procurement means following the contract, implementing the contract, respecting the contract in letter and spirit. So let there be no second thoughts if the deliverables have been validated by our own quality control team. So they need to be accepted. And finally, once the last deliverable has been accepted, it is time to notify completion of the procurement contract. So these are some of the some of the activities which are performed in the control procurement process. There could be more. This is not the exhaustive list, but it gives a fair amount of idea that controlling procurement is just not monitoring and controlling, it is also conducting the procurements. Let's now look at what the control procurement process looks in terms of inputs, outputs, and tools and techniques. Shown on the screen is the general standing model of any monitoring and control process, the standing inputs and outputs. So starting with, because we are dealing with procurements, so it is procurement management plan, lessons learned register, WPDs, which get analyzed into WPI, and if there is a variance, then a change request is raised. So let's see what WPDs can be in the context of control procurements. Here they are. This could be the data which our quality control teams have found while carrying out inspections and tests on the deliverable. This could be the information on the procurement activities that have started or in progress or have completed. This could pertain to costs, the costs that have been incurred by the seller, particularly relevant in cost reimbursable contracts, or what costs have been committed. And now the seller has crossed the point of no return. He cannot take back that activity or the change. He's not committed. He has committed his funds to that particular activity. And then related to that, any invoice which has been given to the buyer is also a WPD. Obviously, these are not just taken at their face values. The buyer carries out a thorough analysis, scrutiny, audit of this data, this information, these invoices, these documents. And once those have been analyzed, they become WPIs. And if there is any variance between these WPIs and these WPDs, then that variance has to be regularized through the change request. These changes could pertain to the contract. These could pertain to any of the performance measurement baselines. They could apply to any project management plan, any project documents. But the important thing is that it is a very formal process, particularly in procurement. These change requests, they must go through perform integrated change control, and because they would most certainly affect the baselines and the project documents and the project management plans, they would be taken to the change control board. Okay, having discussed the general inputs and outputs, let's now talk about specific inputs and outputs. These are the project management plans which are required while controlling procurements. First is the requirements management plan. Why requirements? These are the requirements of the seller. The seller may have specific requirements pertaining to any aspect of procurement. For instance, he may lay down or he may give a requirement that once the deliverables arrive at the project site, then they must be put under shade or under controlled conditions. This is a requirement, a procurement requirement. So because it is a requirement, we need a requirements management plan. The risk management plan. We just discussed that one of the activities we perform during control procurement process is identifying new risks, procurement risks, monitoring and controlling the risks, analyzing new risks, allocating reserves to those risks, devising strategies to deal with those risks. So if risks figure so prominently in the control procurements process, we need the risk management plan. And of course, changes, we discussed about changes to the contract, and whenever there's changes to the contract, there are resultant changes to the baselines, to the project management plans, to the project documents, so hence the requirement of change management plan. The schedule baseline. It is important for the seller to follow the delivery schedule as given in the contract. Now that delivery schedule becomes the schedule baseline. It is contract schedule baseline, and it can also be transferred onto the main schedule baseline so that we know where procurement stands in the context of the overall project schedule performance. So these are the project management plans. There could be more if required, but basically these are a must. Coming to documents. Well, all we have to do is relate documents with the plans. We have a procurement management plan, so we require all the procurement documents, the bidding documents, the contracts, agreement, and any changes, approved changes. Here, approved change request is an input. So any approved change to the bidding documents, to the statement of work, to the contract itself, these are the inputs. Then requirements documentation and the requirements traceability matrix. I just mentioned about requirements. So the seller may have a peculiar requirement for his deliverables. So where are they documented? In the requirements documentation. And then subsequently, if you find anything additional or anything unfamiliar on the project, let's say anything unfamiliar which the seller has supplied, you would like to have a look at who asked for it. And that is where not only requirements documentation, the requirements traceability matrix would also help, because the traceability matrix helps trace a particular requirement right from its origin through its objectives and test cases all the way to the deliverable. So these, you always find them together, and because we are talking about a risk management plan, these are also required, and I have given you other reasons why these are required. Then risk management plan means there should be the risk register, and obviously many risks occur due to wrong assumptions or due to misplaced constraints. So therefore, not only the risk register, but also the assumptions log is required, because assumptions log is not just assumptions, it is also constraints. I say again, many risks occur due to wrong assumptions and misplaced constraints. Therefore, we need both the assumption log and the risk register. Then we talked about the schedule baseline. So if you're talking about the schedule baseline, so it is also logical to have the milestone list, because a milestone list is nothing but an extract or an abridged form of the schedule baseline or the project schedule. So obviously, if we need schedule baseline over here, it is only logical that we have the milestone list over here. And then there are two specific inputs, quality reports. A number of inspections and audits will be carried out, which are tools of quality. Therefore, the audit reports and the inspection reports and the test reports become the quality reports. And obviously, for controlling procurements, these are essential inputs. And finally, the stakeholder register. Who are the stakeholders on a procurement? Not just the buyer and the seller. All those internal stakeholders who were involved in the contracting process, the contracting team, they are the stakeholders. All the internal stakeholders who carried out financial and technical scrutiny of the bids are the stakeholders. All the stakeholders who prepared the documents, the bidding documents, the tendering documents, etc. They are the stakeholders. So stakeholder register is required to know all the stakeholders who were involved in planning of procurement, conducting of procurement, conducting of contracting, conducting of tendering, etc. So it is just not the buyer and the seller who are the stakeholders. It is the quality control team would be stakeholders, because they would be carrying out inspections and tests and other quality control activities. So these are the inputs. On the output side, nothing very special, only amendments to all these documents. So all these documents which are listed on the left are amended here. And here you will find closed procurements, which, as I said, one of the activities to be performed in controlled procurements is to notify closure of the procurement, because once that has been notified, then the aspect of liabilities, liability to the contract also complete. So these were inputs and outputs. I will now just quickly go through the things which we have already discussed. These inputs and their rationales, so I'll just quickly pass through them. These are already in your notes, so you can read them in your own time. I've already explained the rationale of each of these inputs. So I'll just goes through. And now we come to the aspect of tools and techniques. The first tool and technique you find in every monitoring and control process is the expert judgment. But here, expert judgment is required. Why? Because project managers or procurement managers are not legal experts, or for that matter even contract managers. Each and every word written in a contract can have legal implications. Therefore, it is important to have expert advice at hand. In particular, legal advice is required when it comes to interpretation of the terms and conditions or clauses of the contract. We just established that we must interpret the clauses correctly, because any action, or for that matter, any inaction on our part with respect to the contract can have legal implications. Then is the aspect of claims administration. And that is where a project managers or procurement managers' soft skills come handy. Claims normally crop up in fixed price contract whenever there is a change. Because in a fixed price contract, if a change is necessitated, then the project or procurement manager virtually becomes a hostage to the seller, because now seller is at will to dictate any cost to the change. The seller knows that the buyer is constrained to ask him to implement the change, because he cannot now invite a new tender or a new seller to implement a change. It has to be done by this seller. So he's now dictating terms, this seller. And that is where our dispute can arise. First of all, it could be just a difference of opinion. Then it can lead to a claim. The claim can lead to a dispute. So every attempt should be made to resolve this claim or dispute through what is called the alternative dispute resolution techniques. The first step towards alternative dispute resolution is to have a third party review it or evaluate what the situation is and give an opinion. So that is the starter. Should either of the parties do not agree, then comes negotiations, and that is a soft skill, negotiation. And the project needs no stress that a project manager or the contract or the procurement manager or the contract manager should be a good negotiator in order to resolve the claim. Hopefully, things should get settled, claims and disputes should get settled through negotiations. Otherwise, the next step is conciliation. And then is third-party mediation. And then I think that is where it should certainly stop, because after that, the consequences can be real bad for either of the two parties. And that is arbitration. And particularly if this arbitration is going to take place somewhere abroad. Therefore, every attempt should be made to resolve the claims and disputes through alternative dispute resolution. Data analysis, we just talked about reports, performance review reports, firstly by the seller and then the buyer. So these reports fall into the category of data analysis. Then if the project is cost reimbursable, that means you do not know how much is it going to cost towards the end. Therefore, the earned value analysis techniques come handy. And a part of earned value analysis techniques, as you recall, was the trend analysis based on which you could find the estimated completion cost or EAC cost. Even if it is a fixed price contract, then even then earned value analysis would be relevant in the context of schedule. If the deliveries are getting late, it is going to affect the project schedule. So hence the earned value analysis and its part, trend analysis, they become handy. Inspections. Inspections and audits, they are done fairly regularly in procurement projects. What do we inspect? We inspect, firstly, we inspect the working of the seller. The purpose of this inspection is to ensure that the contractor is following and implementing good industrial practices, and he is not indulged in any malpractices like child labor or the general working environment for the workers, the working conditions in the factory, etc. So inspection of the working of the seller or the working conditions of the seller. Then the inspections pertain to the deliverable, the quality control inspections, which then include testing of the deliverables also. So inspections are a key tool, they are a quality control tool, and they are a key tool in procurement. No inspection means bad procurement. It is not a question of trust or friendship. Inspections have to be carried out for a successful procurement. It is as simple as that. Then are the audits. What are the audits? Audits of the procurement processes. And these primarily pertain to the buyer, where he audits the procurement process. But its scope can extend to the seller. And should the scope extend to the seller, then the audit report is also shared with the seller. So that was the control procurements process in the context of inputs, outputs, and tools and techniques. Which brings me to the final slide, which is some aspects of controlling procurements in the context of the specific contract, this contract which has been signed with the seller. Let us take, first of all, the fixed price contract. In the fixed price contract, the risk is seller's. He is bound to provide the procurement in the cost, which is now mentioned in the contract. He cannot go above that. So should the seller feel that he is not going to make his required profit, or he's likely to go into the loss, his usual tactics are to cut scope, quality, or grade. So this is what the quality control teams of the buyer has to watch very closely, that the seller does not cut on scope, quality, or grade. Unfortunately, where a seller has to gratify the buyer or some stakeholders in the buyer's organization, obviously he's not going to pay out of his own pocket. He's going to cut the scope, quality, or grade. So that is the aspect which needs to be watched. The other aspect in the fixed price contract is the aspect of change. For the procurement manager for the procurement manager or the contract project manager of the buyer, a change, and let me say it, can be suicidal. Why? Because the project manager or the procurement manager concedes the total control of the cost to the seller. The seller is now at liberty to dictate any price, and most likely he's going to bloat the price many times over, because he knows now that the buyer is helpless. He has to get this particular change incorporated through this particular seller, and therefore he would be in the driving seat as far as the price is concerned. So he's going to bloat the price, and that is what is going to generate a dispute between the buyer and the seller, and those then alternative resolution techniques would come in handy then. Coming to the cost reimbursable contract, every invoice means more profit for the seller. As you know, in a cost reimbursable contract, the seller gets whatever has been spent on a particular activity or an item, plus a proportional percentage on the basic contract price. So every time he puts in a new invoice, he gets a proportional percentage on the project cost as project cost as mentioned in the contract, or the contract project cost. So the seller would be presenting invoices, and every invoice at the seller's end should be scrutinized thoroughly, should be audited. All the supporting documents should be scrutinized, and only once the seller or the project manager or the the buyer or the project or his project manager or the procurement manager is fully satisfied, then the payment should be cleared. Another usual tactics on part of seller is to add resources to the project and then charge for them. Again, why charge for them? Because he not only will get reimbursed for the resources, he will also get a proportional percentage of the profit of the project or the contracted project cost. So he is to be watched, and that's where the inspections for the work or the works on the contractor is doing on the project becomes very important. to make sure that he's not adding any resources which are not required on the process, on the project, and which will encourage him to put up an invoice. And then if the project manager feels, or the procurement manager feels, that this cost reimbursable project is not helping much, the seller is generating invoices ad nauseum, and the project manager and the procurement manager, they're getting frustrated with the frequency of invoices. They shouldn't hesitate in renegotiating the contract and converting it into a fixed price contract. Please remember that a cost reimbursable contract is calculated on the basis of the contracted project cost. So if it is not working well, either review the contracted project cost, or don't hesitate even to change the contract. Finally, for the time and material contracts, these are for small petty contracts. Obviously, the seller is after extending the time, because more the time, more the payment he gets. So obviously, you need to keep remain on the lookout for that. It is always good to come to the project, to visit the activity first thing in the morning, and give directions and instructions to the seller or to the contractor that by the end of the day, or by the end of the work day, he would expect a certain amount of work to be done. That is the only way to control. Otherwise, there are many malpractices which are carried out in order to extend the project time, because the payment is tied to the project time. So with that, we come to the end of this session on controlling procurements. Thank you very much for joining in. Allah Hafiz.